Well, welcome back to the shop. Grab yourself a cup of coffee, pull up a shop stool. Let's spend a little time chatting. This evening feels a little different, not because this piece of cedar is especially unusual, actually. It's kind of not. And it's not really because I planned anything complicated tonight. Honestly, I just wanted to make a bowl. The grandkids have been very active, and I just needed some time after they went to bed to just be in the shop, to turn something special, to make something that I enjoy. And so it is evening, and I picked up a piece of cedar that, had some problems on the outside, but I thought there was something inside that I could do with it. And honestly, when it came down to it, I just wanted to make a bowl. Sometimes that's enough. My finger is healing. It's still reminding me that I broke it, but it's no longer telling me what I can and can't do. And that's a welcome change. Sometimes getting back to ordinary feels extraordinary. And that's exactly where today's project begins. This cedar, as I mentioned, has been sitting patiently for a while. And on the outside, you can see it very clearly that it doesn't look like much. It's kind of gray and weathered. When I first got these logs, they were sitting outside for a long time. And I got the sense that the logs themselves were just tired. And as I made the blanks out of them and set them on the shelf to be ready, if you didn't know better, you could walk right past these blanks and never even bat an eye. You wouldn't even know they're cedar. But cedar has become really one of my favorite woods because it teaches me the same lesson over and over again. And sometimes I need that. Repetition sometimes is the best way to learn. And I've learned to never judge the inside by the outside. The moment my tool starts cutting into the wood, everything changes. You can see the color appearing, the grain begins to dance. And I tell you, the one thing you can't tell just by watching this video is the aroma that fills my shop. Almost as though the wood has been waiting for someone to discover what it was carrying all along. I don't know. Maybe people are a little like that too. I actually had no plan for this bowl whatsoever. Usually I kind of sketch out the idea in my mind of the shape that I'm chasing before I ever switch the lathe on. And maybe I had some ideas, but the moment I started cutting into it, pieces just didn't flow right, and I had some issues. I had to trim it down further than I wanted to, and I was thinking of doing a wide open vase or kind of a bowl style, but either way, I didn't want to be closed into anything that I had to do. I wanted to do something just for the joy of turning. I think sometimes we spend so much energy trying to control the destination that we forget to enjoy the process. So I simply began a conversation with the wood. As the bowl started to take shape, I think something familiar started to appear. Unfortunately, there was some rot hidden inside. There's a few soft places, nothing really catastrophic, just enough to remind me that this cedar has lived a long life. And that's when I knew this wasn't going to become that wide, sweeping bowl that I first kind of thought in my head that I wanted to do, because I like that shape. The bowl, the blank of wood, wanted to become something else. So I leaned into one of my other favorite forms. I really like this squat little cauldron feel. Reminds me of a movie that I watched when I was a kid, The Black Cauldron. It was one of Disney's first rated PG cartoons, and I remember all the hubbub that surrounded it when it first came out, and I didn't even know if my parents were going to let me see it because it was controversial, but they did, and I did enjoy it. And I can say that shape has always kind of stuck with me. It's something that I just enjoy. It's one of these bowls that it feels a little solid and settled. And I don't always think it's flashy, although cedar can make any shape flashy just because of the color and the grain. But this is a comfortable shape for me. I've been thinking lately how often life changes shape when we're making plans. I mean, you think you're building one thing, then circumstances suggest something else. Sometimes it's exciting. Sometimes it's heartbreaking. Sometimes it's just simply different. A new job, a move, maybe sometimes the loss of someone you love. Children grow up and go off to college. Friendships change. Sometimes a diagnosis comes that we're not prepared for. Sometimes healing. Life has a funny way of asking us to become something we never expected. Most of us resist that. I know I do upon occasion. Well, more than occasion. I know I do. We hold tightly to the picture we drew in our minds. We mourn the version that never came to be. But every once in a while, the unexpected shape ends up becoming our favorite. And it's complicated, but I don't think it's because it was an easier shape or an easier style. I just think sometimes it fits the story better. One of the things that I love about woodworking is that stubbornness rarely wins. The wood has grain. It has knots, it has cracks, it has weaknesses, and you can ignore those things for a little while sometimes, but eventually they'll remind you they're there. The better wood turner isn't the one who forces the wood to obey. It's the one who learns to work with what's been given. I think there's some wisdom there, maybe even a little faith. I've wondered if that's part of how God shapes us, not by forcing us into someone else's design, but by patiently working with who we actually are, our strengths, our scars, our traumas, even the places that feel a little rotten inside. Nothing surprises him. And because God is God, nothing is wasted. He doesn't stand over our lives frustrated because the grain runs a different direction than he expected. That's just silly. He simply keeps carving. One of my favorite verses in Scripture is found in Proverbs chapter 3. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. I've quoted that verse to my head and to people for years. But I think the hardest part isn't trusting God when we understand. It's trusting God when the shape changes, when the bowl you're making isn't the bowl you imagined, when life quietly asks you to let go of your own blueprint. By this point, I think you can tell the cedar is really showing off. Every pass reveals another streak of gold or a ribbon of red, another swirl hidden beneath years of weather. It's amazing what was hiding under something that looks so ordinary. Sometimes change uncovers beauty. Not because change itself is beautiful, and I'll be honest, I struggle with change. Even though in many times and in many different churches, I've been an agent of change because it needed to happen. But I think it's because change reveals what was already there. It peels back the layers. It shows us how we can move through. I don't know what changes you're walking through today. Maybe they're exciting. Who knows? Maybe they're painful. Maybe they're completely unwanted. And I understand that. But I hope you remember something this cedar reminded me of. Not every change is loss. Sometimes it's simply an invitation to become a different kind of beautiful. One thing I've learned over the years, both in ministry and, well, just being a human walking the planet, is that every change involves some measure of loss. Sometimes it's obvious. You lose somebody you love. Sometimes it's quieter than that. A child leaves home and goes off to college. A career shifts and you suddenly find yourself doing something a little different in a different place with a different desk and different coworkers. Your health isn't quite what it used to be, maybe. Friendship that was part of your childhood or a key and critical part of your life slowly fades. The dream you carried for years turns into something different than you imagined. We tend to reserve grief for funerals, but grief shows up anywhere something valuable has been lost. And that's okay. I think we've accidentally convinced ourselves that if we're people of faith, we should move through change quickly. We should smile, maybe quote a Bible verse, but no matter what, we just keep going. But Scripture doesn't paint that picture. God never rebukes people for grieving. He meets them there. Jesus stood outside the tomb of Lazarus, knowing full well what he was about to do. And yet he still wept. That tells me personally that grief isn't the opposite of faith. Sometimes it's simply love with nowhere to go. I have found that freeing because I don't have to pretend every change is easy. I don't have to convince myself that loss doesn't hurt. I don't have to bury disappointment under spiritual language. I can simply admit, man, this hurts. And somehow, God seems remarkably comfortable meeting us in these honest places. Maybe that's because pretending has never healed anyone. Ignoring loss doesn't make it disappear. Stuffing grief down doesn't make us stronger. It usually just makes us carry it longer than we should. I've watched people carry old disappointments for years because they never gave themselves permission to mourn what was lost. Not because they lacked faith, but because they thought faith meant never hurting, never having that kind of pain. I don't believe that's true anymore. I think healthy grief is one of God's gifts to us. It's how our hearts slowly make room for what comes next without pretending the past didn't matter. Maybe that's why this little cedar bowl has been speaking so loudly to me today. It became something beautiful, but only after I stopped insisting it become something else. And maybe that's true of us too. Some seasons aren't asking us to get over what we've lost. They're asking us to honor it, to learn from it, and I think, more importantly, to thank God for what it gave us, and then gently open our hands to whatever He's shaping next. Because the end of one shape isn't necessarily the end of the story. As I said earlier, grief isn't the opposite of faith. Sometimes it's simply love with nowhere to go. Sometimes it's the beginning of another chapter that we couldn't have imagined while we were still holding on to the first one. Well, I think this little bowl turned out pretty well. It certainly wasn't the bowl I thought I was going to make when I first mounted the cedar on the lathe. Somewhere along the way, the wood just had a different story to tell, and I'm glad I listened to it. Maybe that's one of the quiet lessons the shop keeps teaching me. We spend so much of life trying to force things back into the plans that we made, when sometimes the better path is simply learning to work with what we've been given. Not giving up, not settling, just trusting that God is still creating something worthwhile, even when things and the shape changes. If you're walking through a season of change right now, whether it's one you've chosen or one that's been chosen for you, I hope you'll give yourself permission to feel what you're feeling. Grieve what you've lost. Celebrate what remains. Stay open to what God may still be creating in your life. And don't lose heart. Some of the most beautiful things I've ever made began as pieces of wood that looked ordinary, weathered, even damaged. They simply needed someone willing to look a little deeper and stay with the process. Maybe that's true of you too. I want to thank you for spending a little time with me here in the shop. I never take it for granted that you chose to grab a cup of coffee and pull up a shop stool and share these moments with me. Whether you've been here since the beginning or you simply stumbled across this little corner of YouTube today, I'm glad you're here. If this conversation encouraged you, I'd love for you to subscribe and join me each week here on Grace, Grit, and Grounds. There are always more bowls to turn, more coffee to drink, and by God's grace, more lessons waiting to be discovered in the grain. Until next time, remember that grace builds what grit sustains. May God give you the grace to trust Him in every season, the grit to keep moving faithfully through whatever lies ahead, and the eyes to recognize the quiet beauty He's shaping in your life, even when that shape changes. I'll see you next time.